Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Mandelson, A Homosexual History. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer, historian, member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
On last week's episode, we left the titular Peter Mandelson having made it through the crucible of late 80s homophobia in order to become Labour's unlikely candidate for Hartlepool in the 1992 general election. Where are we picking up this week?
Well, we'll start where we left off, the eve of the 1992 election, and hopes at that point were very high, both for Labour and for Mandelson himself. So Margaret Thatcher, who'd been in power for 11 years, had finally been toppled in 1990 by her own consiglieres as the Tory party had torn itself apart over the issue of Europe.
Imagine that happening.
Yeah, time to take another drink, Ben. In the leadership battle that followed, she was replaced by John Major, a man who's so dull that it was once said of him that he actually ran away from the circus to become an accountant. That's a little line about him, which is actually partly true, because his father had actually been a circus trapeze artist who'd fought in the Uruguayan Civil War, and he gave up on his life of adventure to start his own garden gnome factory. Major himself moved away from that to become an accountant and a lifelong Tory. So having lost Thatcher...
Garden gnome factory?
Well, yeah, where do you think garden gnomes come from? Someone has to make them.
Supposedly.
And it's John Major's dad. So having lost Thatcher, who was the charismatic centre of their party, and they'd sort of reached this point of political exhaustion, and it really looked like the Tories were limping on towards disaster. At one point, Labour was actually leading the Tories by 23 points in the polls. Inflation was in double digits, interest rates were at 15%, and unemployment was at 2.5 million. And geopolitically, the wind of change was blowing as well. The Soviet Union, who was Thatcher's great adversary, had collapsed. And this air of youthful optimism seemed to be brushing away the old guard all across Europe. Meanwhile, in the US, the Democrats were running a youthful ticket themselves, with Clinton Gore busy campaigning for their own election in the 92 election. And it seemed almost inevitable that in the UK, the Tories, who were still reeling from the catastrophe of the poll tax, were at the end of the road.
What was the poll tax?
The poll tax was a very unpopular tax. It was actually called the community charge. It was brought in by Thatcher, and it was basically a very unprogressive form of taxation that was opposed by a mass organised campaign of largely working class people. And there was also a campaign of non-payment, so it became a huge liability, which was eventually rescinded. But somehow, however, Kinnock managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, as they said, and the Conservatives received the highest number of votes ever cast in a British general election.
How the hell they managed to do that?
The blame was really put onto Kinnock and Labour's presentation. While they were riding high in the polls, they tried to project confidence, but in reality they overshot and projected complacency. But Mandelson himself fared a lot better. He won Hartlepool, and he even increased the Labour majority there. Kinnock resigned, and there was a leadership campaign in which he was replaced by John Smith, who was a pretty solid Labour right, social democratic politician who continued very cautiously with the constitutional reforms to the party. Mandelson was now a backbencher. Smith didn't trust him particularly, but that was fine for Peter Mandelson. He had begun to formulate a long game, and he was thinking in terms of generations, not general elections. He'd met these two promising young Scottish MPs who'd been in Parliament since 1983, and they seemed to share his reforming, more media-oriented vision for the party. These three men wanted to go further than mere constitutional tinkering like Smith, and they wanted to renovate the whole party, removing Clause 4, the commitment to nationalisation, from the party's constitution. One of these men was an obvious leader to whom Mandelson initially nailed his colours. He was intellectually engaged, he had a PhD, he was solidly Labour, the son of a minister in the Kirk, the Church of Scotland. He'd been a journalist and a university lecturer, and he seems much more at ease with the media. That was Gordon Brown. The other was a young upstart who had worked under Roy Hattersley as an assistant Treasury spokesman. He was a privately educated former barrister, the son of a barrister. He had flirted with Trotskyism, rock stardom, and even stand-up comedy before drifting towards Christianity, and with it, sort of Christian socialism. And then he became a Labour MP. That was Tony Blair. So Peter had wanted Gordon to stand in the contest against John Smith for the leader, but he had given John Smith his word that he wouldn't. And he also didn't think that he and Tony would win on a joint ticket. But the morning after John Smith's election, the Sunday Times ran a headline, "The Leader Labour Missed," featuring this big photograph not of Smith, but of Tony Blair. And in his memoirs, Mandelson notes with no little pride that, quote, "The suspicion that I had set up the Sunday Times piece was correct," end quote. The article ended by saying, quote, "Will the new leader have the wisdom to put a man like Tony Blair into the job of Shadow Home Secretary?" So perhaps you're now getting a taste of how Mandelson works with this briefing and counter-briefing. He's milking these relationships with the press to push sort of internal political buttons and lines, and he's making his way of doing things unavoidable.
It's interesting that you mentioned there that at this time, Gordon Brown is considered the better media performer than Tony Blair, because I don't think that's the impression that a lot of people now have who have met both of them.
No, absolutely not. This was a point where I guess his profile was bigger, as much as him being a better media operator. He had more experience. He was seen as the big hitter, whereas Blair at this point was a bit of a novice. He didn't have that same background within the Labour movement.
You know, I met Gordon Brown once.
Oh, really?
It was in 2010, and I was a student at New York University, and Gordon Brown had been until recently, until was it that year, 2010 UK general election? Yeah, until earlier that year.
Yep.
He had been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he came to give a talk to a class on ethical leadership, which was led by one of NYU's top executives. And what she had done before coming to NYU and lecturing on ethical leadership was she was the head lawyer for Monsanto in the 1990s.
So she knows all about ethical
She
leadership.
knows so much about ethical leadership. But anyway, Gordon Brown came in and gave a lecture, and we were allowed to ask questions. And I asked, after this sort of elucidation of these many grave problems in the world, what gave him hope? And this man, who until months earlier had led one of the world's major economies and powers, said that what gave him hope was a new website where people could sign petitions. You could have millions of people sign a petition for something. It wasn't that extraordinary. And that was really a foundational moment for me in terms of realizing that the grown-ups are not in control. They have lost the plot. There is no plan. No one knows what's going on.
Of course, Brown was the intellectual heavyweight of these three. He was probably exhausted by the end of 2010, to be fair to him. But you can see how he's working here and how he influences the party as well through the media. And so it was. Smith actually did promote both Gordon and Tony to the cabinet. Blair as the Shadow Home Secretary and Brown as the Shadow Chancellor. So both very big roles.
Is one of those two roles considered to be like much bigger than the other?
Yes, they're four of the what are called the great offices of state, which is Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, and then the Home Secretary in that order. So Chancellor of the Exchequer is the second great office of state in the UK. The three men, Peter, Gordon and Tony, I think it's fair to say, were friends at this point. And it was this close personal and professional relationship which became the setting for a frankly Shakespearean tale of deceit and sabotage which was on the way. But together these men advocated the adoption of a new political ideology for the Labour Party, one that was influenced by the British sociologist Anthony Giddens, who had advocated an ideology he called the Third Way, which sort of eschewed these traditional socialist, centrally planned economic policies like Keynesian interventionism and high taxation, but also the Thatcherite neoliberal belief in the free market as this panacea to all social ills. And so in an increasingly globalized economy, it advocated avoiding capital flight, which is the rich taking their money and investment away from high taxation economies. But it also claimed to balance this commitment to social justice with the acceptance of market capitalism and a shift from welfare policies to workfare policies. Perhaps a good example of these politics in action is the adoption of public-private partnerships known as PFIs, or private financial initiatives, to finance big infrastructure projects like school and hospital building. They're doing something within the NHS, but they're using this private finance to do it. It's not privatization, but it's also not state investment.
Yeah, it was the same. Similar winds were blowing through in the United States. Bill Clinton ran for president on a promise to end welfare as we know it, and responding to this racist stereotype of the so-called welfare queen that Ronald Reagan had famously brought into the public discourse, ended up significantly reducing the amount of aid and the entitlement to aid for poor families. And even the new name of welfare, which is still called now, which is temporary assistance for needy families, gives you a clue as to what's going on there. And of course, you put in all of these work requirements and all of this means testing, and then in order to get a benefit, which is supposed to enable you to then live, you spend so much time jumping through hoops to get the benefit which you need that you then actually can't, paradoxically, get an education, advance. It's basically a way of preserving this surplus of extremely vulnerable, extremely precarious labor without having people like dying on the streets in too great numbers. And it's really very nasty stuff.
Yeah, so on the ticket, they're saying they do believe in limited state intervention for social justice, but that's balanced by this sort of commitment to these free market principles and entrepreneurship. And of course, in the UK's case, very pointedly in opposition to anything approaching a planned economy in a socialist model.
But this is also, I just want to point out the origin, this third way ideology, of a lot of the kind of overcomplicated means testing type stuff that our American listeners are going to associate with kind of establishment Democratic Party politics, right? The idea that if you bring something in, if you bring in some kind of a benefit, it has to be temporary and it has to be means tested 17 different ways. And like all of that stuff, that's all coming out of this third way ideology.
Yeah. So a good example of the rhetoric for this sort of politics would actually be Mandelson himself, who once said that he was, quote, intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes, end quote.
The problem, of course, being that, as we now see, once people get a certain amount of rich, there is no way to constrain them anymore with old-fashioned normal state policy.
Yeah, they don't pay their taxes.
Yeah, they buy their way out of paying their taxes because they have the resources to do so.
And then another aspect that was enthusiastically embraced by this trio, which we might talk about in later episodes, is the commitment to this robust, aggressive security state, not just in terms of a sort of pro-NATO Atlanticism that they adopted from the traditional Labour right, but also an increasing authoritarianism and carceralism. So as an example, the UK prison population in 1990 was 45,000 prisoners, but by the end of the last New Labour government in 2010, it had risen to an all-time high of 85,500, so almost double the number of people in prison.
There does seem to really be a very strong authoritarian, communitarian, like curtain-twitching streak in this new Labour project. And you see it now recently as Keir Starmer came back. There's all this stuff about antisocial behavior, and it's really actually more so than the Tories in a weird way.
Yeah, definitely. New Labour lack the libertarian streak that does and has always existed on one wing of the Tory party. And they do favour this sort of thing, which is a sort of soft approach to, it's not hang 'em and flog 'em like the Tories would be, but it's actually much more insidious. So stuff like antisocial behaviour orders, these rules that give a huge amount of discretion and flexibility towards the police and towards judiciary. And we see that again, of course, in their response to protest as well. Throughout the New Labour project, and especially around the war in Iraq, they increase this clampdown on civil liberties. You can see today there's thousands, literally thousands and thousands of people in the UK currently waiting trial, having been arrested for peacefully, silently standing in the street with a sign saying they support Palestine action, which is currently a criminal offence, although we'll see whether that will remain so for so long. But this is definitely a tendency within New Labour. And as you said, they were part of this wider shift in the politics of traditional centre-left parties in developed economies towards building a consensus around retaining and even furthering the sort of reforms that were brought in by Reagan and Thatcher, but through a political coalition with traditional centre-left voters, which did see the state as having a limited role in tackling those social ills. Later in 1992, Clinton beat George H.W. Bush to the US presidency on this third way policy platform, whilst in Australia, Bob Hawke had won 4 successive elections for the Australian Labour Party with a sort of third way strategy.
Bill Clinton, who Gary Indiana memorably described as having, and I quote, up close a face that looks like it's made out of fresh fetal tissue.
Yeah, yes, having seen him, that's extremely accurate. And Clinton actually was especially influential for this Blair, Brown, Mandelson troika, this triumvirate. And Gordon and Tony took multiple trips, in fact, to the States in order to study Clintonism in action in the run-up. On one trip in 1993, they met with Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve at the time, Clinton's pollster, Stan Greenberg, and various sort of Democratic Party bigwigs, and they began explicitly building those links and learning from them. And back in London, John Smith, the Labour leader, was appalled. According to Anthony Selden, Blair's biographer, he summoned Mandelson to his office and he said, quote, all this Clintonization business, it's just upsetting everybody. He's alleged to have told him, quote, stop boat rocking with all this talk of change and modernization, end quote. So you can see here that Mandelson and the New Labour project was going far too fast for people like Smith.
And just to be clear, the objection to Clintonism among these more traditional Labour people is that it is too right-wing? Is that it is too much of a departure from the kind of traditional values of the labor movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a movement for change that's happening within the Labour Party at the time. It's on the edges. The new Labour was at this point on the edges. Under Smith, it looked like the brakes had been put on the third way, and the trio were prepared to bide their time, but it actually came a lot sooner than they might have expected. In 1994, just 2 years into his leadership, John Smith had a heart attack and he died. He was just 55. There was quite a significant outpouring of grief and a sense that an opportunity for a certain type of future Labour Party had been lost, but maybe that's a sort of retrospective thing based on what came afterwards, a lost moment of what could have been, but it opened up an opportunity for the Troika to put their vision into action. There was another leadership campaign, and the natural candidate here, as I said, probably was Brown. He was older, he was more experienced, he was much closer to what the party might have expected for their new leader. Brown himself certainly regarded the job as his, and with Mandelson behind him as a close ally and Tony Blair as his sort of Robin to his Batman, he was beginning to envision himself as the future Prime Minister. But Mandelson had seen the opinion polls, he'd read newspaper columns, he'd talked to his fellow MPs, and all of this suggested that actually at this point Blair had a much better public image. He was on the ascendancy, especially with the sort of swing voters that he felt that they needed to target. And what happens now is a sort of what-if moment of speculative history, this single decision that would dictate the fate of the Labour Party for the next 20-something years up to today. And the events are still a matter of some debate, but the story that's entered legend is that there was a meeting in Granita, a very fancy restaurant in Islington, that happened 3 weeks after Smith's death, where Brown and Blair met and they hashed out a pact, an agreement, what's called the deal. In reality, it actually seems like the conversation had been ongoing beforehand, and the Granita meeting had been a sort of formality or celebration of the pact. And in his memoirs, Mandelson talks about the fact that during this meeting, he was at home drafting a press release about it. But its mythical status is now very much secure. And in fact, there's a fantastic Peter Frears film from 2003 called The Deal, which is on YouTube. I very much recommend watching if you're interested in this sort of thing.
Yeah, we'll link it in the show notes. Quick question that immediately comes to my mind. If Brown at this point seems like the more obvious candidate, why on earth did the deal that they worked out end up benefiting Blair? Was this something that Brown got talked into? Was there some way in which Brown was actually in a weaker point? Was this Mandelson's particular weird strategic genius where they managed to talk Gordon Brown out of advocating for his own, presumably, interests as the leader?
This is like one of the major questions and moments of political intrigue in British politics for the last 50 years. Depends on who you listen to. Some people think that Mandelson betrayed him. Some people think he was taught around. Some people thought that Brown lost his nerve. Some people thought that he saw that actually it was true. Blair probably was a stronger candidate in terms of public perception and in terms of those swing voters. It's a strange moment because Brown was and remained in many ways a heavyweight. But under the terms of the pact, Brown said that he would stand aside. He'd let Blair stand for the leader. And assuming that they were successful in the general election, which at this point must have felt almost inevitable, Blair would then serve for 2 terms and then he would stand aside and allow Brown to take over. And Brown, meanwhile, would serve as Blair's chancellor, but in a much more expanded and powerful role, which would allow him to implement his own social agenda for fairness and social justice using the tools of a much strengthened chancellor. So it would be a double-headed leadership in which Blair was the figurehead pushing forwards, but behind the scenes, Brown's agenda would have as much weight as Blair's.
So Brown did get something for his deal.
Brown did get something, but you will note that after 2 terms as Prime Minister, Tony Blair did not resign. He actually waited until the worst possible moment for Brown, which was just before the financial crisis, and really dealt a huge blow to Brown's historical legacy.
Is it right to say that basically everything good that happened during New Labour was part of Brown's domestic policy agenda?
It's a real curate's egg. It's tempting to say that. I think that's not necessarily the case. There was stuff like the massive expansion of employees in the NHS and things like that, and rebuilding the NHS from the edge of collapse. But there were plenty of terrible things that Brown suggested. And as we'll go on to discuss, the personal politics in the relationship of these 3 men, and especially Brown's, really was quite devastating in some ways for the New Labour project. Brown had a tendency towards being grumpy, He held a grudge. He was a bully, according to some people. So it's a very complicated moment.
God, you'd never be able to tell me that man was grumpy. No.
I would say in his defense, and I'd say this is obviously not a supporter of the New Labour project, as listeners will probably have figured out by now. To me, one thing that Brown seems to have, which I would say Blair and Mandelson lack, is a certain ethical and moral fortitude. He sticks by certain beliefs, which is probably why he found it so hard to get on with him in lots of ways. And that we can talk about in perhaps the last episode, because he has come out very strongly in defense of women and children who were victims of Epstein, for example. But I have to say, this might be a matter of temperament. That sort of personality of Brown's reminds me very much of my mother, so maybe I have a warmth towards it for that reason.
Something about being from the very north of those aisles.
Perhaps.
All right. It's odd, I think, from the U.S. perspective, exactly how personal all of this is, and also how much it can be summed up in terms of the relationships between a relatively small number of people, right? You could imagine an agreement being made by leading Democrats to rig a primary or to not participate in a primary to favor someone else, right? That happens all the time, right? That's how Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee in 2024, is Bernie Sanders was ahead, but not with a majority, and everyone else dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden, who was in number 2, and Biden won, right? But, like, okay, maybe Mayor Pete was offered a cabinet position in exchange for this, but it wasn't like the culmination of this years-long plan, right? Like, all these people are in the U.S. having some kind of often years-long profile building as a way of competing democratically as to who's going to represent what kinds of politics when you then get to the national level. And here it seems like this is just completely 100% happening behind closed doors. And basically, just by moving 3 or 4 people out of the way, Peter Mandelson was able to convert the Labour Party from something that was much more in the interests of a broader working class to something that was much more in the interests of a much smaller group of people.
Yeah, and partly that's an issue of the constitutional makeup of the two countries. The fact that you have primaries in the US, open primaries, which you don't have in the UK, of course, but also that you don't have a presidential system, that you have a system of collective cabinet responsibility, which involves in some ways a lot more autonomy it can involve a lot more autonomy between departments, which is why the Chancellor has such a much more powerful role in the UK than what's the equivalent in the US? What?
Secretary of the Treasury, but the Secretary of the Treasury does not broadly determine budget policy. Like, the Secretary of the Treasury has a much more technical remit.
This was supposed to be a partnership with these two men meeting regularly without civil servants present to ensure that Blair's leadership was underpinned by Brown's political commitment to social equality. And that at least was what Gordon Brown believed. But life, as they say, has a funny way. The lesson, as always, is to get it written down on paper. So this was the initial split in the Troika. These 3 men, they had to make a decision who was going to run. And of course, Brown was going to be quite testy and pissed off about it. But over the summer and the autumn, this once quite close partnership between Brown and Mandelson dissolved into open enmity, warfare. According to McIntyre, Mandelson's biographer, in September of 1994, with Tony now the leader, the party organised this small conference at a fancy 5-star country house hotel on the edge of the New Forest. To this hotel, they invited a group of loyalists and they were going to plan the party's next moves. Peter drove Tony and Gordon down there himself the night before everyone else, and they had a dinner in which they would establish their 3-way party line together. So Gordon, who glories in the nickname Prudence, is of course known for his fastidious research and planning, and he arrived at the conference with this whole new personnel roster that he wanted to put in place for the party, including one of his own allies, Michael Wills, as the new Deputy General Secretary. But Tony didn't agree at this dinner before the conference, and Gordon expected his old pal and ally Peter to back him up, but he didn't. And so later, when Tony had gone to bed, Gordon and Peter had a last drink together, and as they were sipping what I assume was a whiskey, Gordon called Peter on it, and he asked him why he didn't back him. Peter should know, he seemed to think, that if the two of them were of one mind about something, then of course Tony would always come round, so they should make up their mind together. But at this point, Peter revealed his hand. So to quote McIntyre's fascinating biography, quote, Mandelson then said that his loyalty to Brown was not in question, but that he was not going to get into some sort of alliance to outmaneuver Tony, end quote. So I think it's probably fair to say that Gordon had assumed they already were in an alliance, and Peter was clearly withdrawing his affection for Gordon, and the loyalty was in question.
Right. And the loyalty was also being moved towards Tony Blair, who for Mandelson was probably ideologically a more comfortable, malleable partner, right?
Very hard to actually pin down what Peter Mandelson's position is ideologically at this position. I think he moves himself over to Tony Blair because Tony Blair is the leader. And McIntyre says that Mandelson himself dates this drink specifically as the beginning of this split. Although McIntyre thinks that that's an oversimplification, and Brown must, of course, have been smarty from the leadership election, amongst other things. But it's clear from this point things go downhill rapidly. In Mandelson's own memoir, he says that Gordon's last remark to him was, then choose for yourself. Quote, he turned, went into his room and shut the door in my face. I felt hurt and stunned by what he said, and feared immediately that something between us was broken that night.
Oh no, why would it own what you did? You changed your alliance as soon as the other guy became leader. Just say that. Own it.
Ben, this is him owning what he did, because this memoir that he put out, Classic Mandelson, is not a sort of end of career sharing everything that happened, deeply insightful description of what happened. This is something that he released in 2010, I believe, at a very specific moment of his career in order to set some things straight. The memoir itself is part of his political maneuvering. I just like the tone of it. I feel like he's got a future career writing sort of bodice rippers. That I felt hurt and stunned and feared immediately that something between us was broken that night. The door slamming in his face. I love it.
Oh.
But Brown clearly regarded himself as being betrayed by Mandelson. And while the triumvirate between the three would continue for more than a decade, it was riven by this distrust and by the briefing of one side against the other. Brown was repeatedly frustrated that he would persuade Blair of something as a good idea, only to find that Mandelson had later undermined him. And at one point, they even drew up some rules of engagement. They would agree to meet each other and hash out their position before any meetings with Blair. But Mandelson would still disrupt meetings that were run by Brown himself. He would complain that Brown would just talk over him or ignore him at meetings. According to one observer of these meetings, Mandelson, quote, got away with murder in his acid and contemptuous asides, end quote. And at its worst, Brown and Mandelson actually couldn't even be in the same room together. According to the journalist Robert Peston, quote, the sheer hatred and mistrust of Mandelson that was engendered in Brown was poisonous to him and the party for years, end quote. And I think if you actually have to point at a political flaw in the Labour Party, in New Labour in this period, the main political big P flaw, the interpersonal political problems within Labour was, of course, this alliance that had broken almost as soon as it had been made, but continued because everyone needed to continue fighting between Blair's camp and Brown's camp, with Mandelson in the middle making it worse, was spectacular for another decade. So over the summer...
And so Mandelson managed to play consistently both camps against one another in order to maintain his own power within the party? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and we can talk about this more in next week's episode. But in the 2000s, when Brown becomes Prime Minister, he actually is forced to bring Mandelson back into the fold against his better judgment, which is something that obviously repeatedly happens with Mandelson. Over the summer of 1994, they appointed this new press secretary, who was a Scottish journalist named Alistair Campbell, and they began preparing for Blair's conference speech in October. Campbell would become another figure who is integral to New Labour and is as famous as the big three, really, in his role. He had been political editor of the centre-left tabloid The Daily Mirror, and he was a close advisor to its owner, the deeply corrupt and highly litigious crook and former Labour Party MP, Robert Maxwell. Now, I can say that he's deeply corrupt despite the fact that he's highly litigious because he's dead. And after he died, it was revealed that he had actually embezzled hundreds of millions of pounds from his own workers' pension funds.
Oh my God.
Money that was eventually reimbursed, and only partly, by the British taxpayer. And Maxwell's death in 1991 had been spectacular and newsworthy too. He'd fallen off the side of his yacht in the middle of the night in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So the name of that yacht, Ben? The Lady Ghislaine, named after his beloved youngest daughter, one Ghislaine Maxwell. Have you heard of her?
Oh, yes, I believe I have heard of her. Is that how you say it? Is it Ghislaine?
That's how I would say
I've
it.
always had this thought that it should be like Ghislaine because I think it should be fancy, but maybe Ghislaine is right.
I'd listened to another podcast where the woman who presents it refuses to pronounce it anywhere close to right, and she calls her Ghislaine.
I like Ghislaine.
It's definitely not Ghislaine. It's not Ghislaine, surely. So Campbell's strategy was very similar to Mandelson's when he had been a director of communications. He would modernize the communication strategy. He'd pull these techniques from marketing and advertising, such as focus groups, to rethink how to market or even how to decide government policies. And he would centralize all communications through his office at Millbank, which were the party campaign headquarters. It was called Millbankization. And that was in order to control and focus the message. And he'd also use sound bites and pre-planned, pre-dropped stories to further certain messages. If you think of the British TV show The Thick of It, that's absolutely based here on Campbell's operation. So Mandelson and Campbell, taking their lead from these marketing professionals, rebranded the Labour Party. And when Blair took to the stage to deliver his conference speech in October that year, he did so in front of a backdrop bearing a new slogan: New Labour, New Britain. New Labour would become actually the name of the party, but also the ideology of Blair and Brown and Mandelson and Campbell. But what does New Labour actually mean? Here's a quote from Blair's speech. Working together, solidarity, cooperation, partnership. These are our words. This is my socialism. And we should stop apologising for using the word. It's not the socialism of Marx or state control. It's rooted in a straightforward view of society, in the understanding that the individual does best in a strong and decent community of people with principles and standards and common aims and values, end quote. Which is nice, but it does remind me of that episode of The Simpsons where the aliens body snatch Bill Clinton and he gives this stump speech where he says, "But tonight I say we move towards freedom, forward, not backward, upward, not forward, and always twirling towards freedom."
It's very, my principles are the principles of hardworking families all across this country.
Yes. Like, who would disagree with the idea that we'd like a strong, decent community of common aims and values? But what does that actually mean? Because what does those look like? There's nothing in here that anyone could reasonably oppose.
So he's basically turning New Labour into the party of motherhood and apple pie. Our subscribers on Patreon and Apple Podcasts make it possible for us to do all of the work of creating this show and to give out all of the main feed episodes for the show for free. That means our main episodes, our special episodes, and also exciting special projects like this one, and we've got more in the works.
So to help support Bad Gays, head on over to patreon.com/badgayspod or look for us on Apple Podcasts. Subscribers also get access to Extra Bad Gays, a monthly podcast where me and Ben talk about everything queer-related in culture, media, politics, as well as answering questions about love, sex, and everything else from our listeners in our regular Gaggany Gunkles section.
And if you subscribe to Extra Bad Gays, you can always listen one episode ahead to the entire Mandelson A Homosexual History miniseries. So do head over and check it out. Thanks.
So the truth was in there. The speech was very optimistic and it portrayed the party at the start of a new era. Blair said, quote, "We have changed. We were right to change. Parties that do not change die, and this party is a living movement, not a historical monument. If the world changes and we don't, then we have become of no use to the world. Our principles cease being principles and just ossify into dogma. We haven't changed to forget our principles, but to fulfill them. Not to lose our identity, but to keep our relevance," end quote. And you can see its roots here in Neil Kinnock's conference speech when he was kicking out Militant, both this supposed anti-ideological line, but also the appeal to this traditional idea of what a labour movement is. Now, it's easy to see the New Labour rebrand for certainly what it became and maybe what it always was, which was a sort of technocratic managerial movement based on maintaining political power. That's not how it was sold. And he would then go on in the speech to say, quote, "It's time we had a clear, up-to-date statement of the objects and objectives of our party," end quote. And many in the conference hall absolutely loved the speech, but his old adversary, Arthur Scargill, who was still at this point a party member, the leader of the miners' strike, he recognised that what he was implying with that statement, he was intending to scrap Clause 4, this core Labour commitment within its constitution to the nationalisation of industry, and instead to embrace the markets and private ownership.
And you had mentioned this old fight in the Labour Party between a Labour left that were known as the Clause 4 people, right? The people more focused on the fight against private ownership and for collective ownership. And then on the other side, the Clause 1 people, who are the people more focused on electability. And what you're telling me now is that Tony Blair is trying to push through the kind of final victory for Clause 1 over Clause 4.
By scrapping Clause 4.
Yeah, by
yes.
literally deleting it.
And yeah. So Mandelson with Blair and Brown at this point was, as you say, finishing what Kinnock and Hattersley had started, although perhaps inadvertently. But it was a fundamental shift in the ethos of the Labour Party and how it was run and who it was for. And it became known as the Clause 4 moment. There was a period where that became a sort of idiom in British English for the moment where everything changes, a definitive break with the past.
The Bill Clinton equivalent is known as the Sister Souljah moment, when basically Sister Souljah, who is a rapper, a political activist, was talking about the 1992 Los Angeles riots and placed them in the context of the fact that most violence in the United States that occurs across a color line is violence against black people from white people. And Bill Clinton decided to make an example of her and call her out as a way of demonstrating to the center that he was willing to criticize members of his own coalition. And he does so in front of Jesse Jackson, who harshly criticizes him. But this ends up being a moment that gets credited by a lot of people with helping Bill Clinton rise and build his profile. And so it's maybe a similar kind of analogy.
Yeah, that sounds similar. And what it symbolizes is that it has this young leadership, it has this optimistic, centralizing message, and it was starting in some ways at this moment to look like the polar opposite of a Tory party who were themselves mired in the internal divisions and the stuffy morality. So the tables had turned. Now it looked like it was the Tories who were stuck in the past and not Labour. In the 1990s, morality returned once again to the front pages of the newspapers. In 1993, John Major attempted to mimic Thatcher's strident moral voice in his own conference speech. The recent headlines had been full of this hand-wringing contempt for the breakdown of social and moral values, especially around changing family makeups. At this point, it was single mothers and not homosexuals who were the evil of the day. And his speech decried this supposed social collapse that had resulted from 60s liberalisation. I'm going to do the voice for Major as well.
Do you know, the truth is, much as things have changed on the surface, underneath we're still the same people. The old values, neighbourliness, decency, courtesy, they're still alive. They're still the best of Britain. They haven't changed, and yet somehow people feel embarrassed by them. Madam President, we shouldn't be. It's time to return to those old core values, time to get back to basics, to self-discipline and respect for the law, to consideration for others, to accepting a responsibility for yourself and your family and not shuffling off on other people and the state.
Wow. Did he actually sound that much like Kermit the Frog?
Actually, that's neither John Major nor Kermit the Frog. It's actually Steve Coogan in A Day to Day.
Okay.
You've probably not seen this. I'm sure
I haven't.
I'm sure British listeners will know.
In 1978, no one died.
Yeah.
In 1979, no one died.
It also sounds a lot like Keir Starmer now, actually. They both have that kind of clogged back of the throat.
Yeah, nasal.
Yeah.
And like Keir Starmer, it's also quite dull. Like it doesn't even have the sort of oomph of Thatcher, as much as you may detest her, I do. It's a small vision. Oh, it's time for self-discipline and respecting your elders. He called this campaign Back to Basics. And while it must have seemed like a good idea at the time, it was to become an absolute plague on the government. In reality, if you actually read the whole speech, it claimed to be more about sort of crime than sexual ethics and personal ethics. But it was read, I think correctly in my view, as part of this sort of wider conservative dog whistle against everyone from single parents to homosexuals. And it was a terrible idea from the start because Tory MPs are notoriously dirty dogs with very kinky private lives. And of course, that was absolute catnip to the British tabloids who could now go after them. Just the previous year, Tory MP Alan Amos had been caught cruising on Hampstead Heath. And then following fast on that, there was a story about David Mellor, a Tory MP who'd been all over the tabloids for an affair where, wearing only a Chelsea Football Club shirt, he'd sucked the toes of his mistress before finally resigning after being caught taking a holiday paid for by the daughter of the finance director. You will never guess. The finance director of what?
The Chelsea Football Club?
No, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
What?
How that happens, I do not know.
What? Oh my God. Oh my God.
And following his Back to Basics speech, there was this sort of rolling news cycle for literally years covering every type of sex scandal for a start. In 1994, a Tory MP was found dead in his own home, hanging from an electrical cord, dressed only in stockings and suspenders with an orange in his mouth. Clearly autoerotic asphyxiation. Another Tory MP was forced to admit that he'd been on holiday to Barbados with a 20-year-old male lover, which at the time was underneath the age of consent for gay men.
Oh, wow.
Another male MP resigned after being caught by the tabloids having a MMF threesome with a friend of his and his girlfriend.
Oh.
As far as I'm concerned, that's all good, clean fun. It's none of my business, even if it is sometimes on dubious ground in terms of personal ethics. But there were much more serious allegations involved as well, of affairs, people cheating on their wives, illegitimate and unacknowledged children, and then of actual corruption and fraud, of people being paid cash to ask questions in Parliament, and of all sorts of links to dodgy businessmen. The word on everyone's lips at the time was sleaze, which is a very peculiar British euphemism for this combination of minor sexual transgression and then serious fraud. So when the 1997 general election finally rolled around, the Tories no longer had this moral high ground when it came to sexual ethics. I don't want to echo a sort of judgmental moral tone here. The corruption on display in the Tory party at the time was absolutely grotesque and frequently criminal. Their sexual deviancy is neither here nor there to me. But the issue, of course, is hypocrisy. If you're trying to make political capital off attacking single mothers, you can't then go around seducing young women and abandoning them when they get pregnant. The whole country seemed to be locked in this increasingly seedy soap opera amongst the very people who were supposed to represent the establishment and the moral order of the time. Even the royals were getting up to it. In 1993, the tabloids reported on tapped phone calls from the married Prince Charles, now the King, to his married mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles, now the Queen, where the King fantasized about being reincarnated as one of her tampons. Quoted in Newsweek at the time, one Tory minister complained that the puritanical reaction to this sort of outbreak of shagging was going too far. Quote, "It's getting ridiculous," he said. "It seems there's a policy of one bonk and you're out." End quote. A bonk, Ben, is a sort of peculiar British tabloidism for sex.
I know what a bonk is, unfortunately, and leave it to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to come up with a word for sex that could only have been come up with by someone who's never had it, except perhaps once per conceived child, with every shade drawn, every light turned out, and somehow several woolen items of clothing being worn during it.
Yeah, it's this strange mix of seediness and infantilization. It's, I think, really peculiar to the British upper class. It's naughty. But the fact is, of course, that personal and political lives are intertwined, and not least for Peter Mandelson. And it's around this time that his old friends noticed that with his proximity to power, his social life was changing considerably. We see the old Lambeth Peter recede and this new Notting Hill Peter emerge, one who's enraptured not by a little dinner with his old friends, but instead by these glittering parties and glitzy, famous new buddies that this growing public profile provided.
I've been to a marvelous party with Nana and Nunu and Nell. It was in the fresh air. We went as we were, we stayed as we were, which was hell.
Which was hell.
For Tony got fried on Chianti and talked about scrapping Clause 4. I knew that the fun was bound to begin when Gordon got blind on Dubonnet and gin and pricked his veneer with a Cartier pin. I couldn't have liked it more. Okay, you've got to keep that in. I can't believe I just came up with that on the fly.
So there's a fascinating chapter in McIntyre's biography of Peter Mandelson where he contrasts his 40th birthday party in 1993, which he describes as, quote, "a happy, boisterous and distinctively labourish occasion," end quote, with his 43rd birthday party in 96, which was a dinner party at the home of Sir Charles Pole, a civil servant who was one of Thatcher's most important foreign affairs advisors, and his wife, the very glamorous and vivacious Carla Pole. It's spelt Powell, so Powell, but they pronounce it Pole. Now, Ben, this is time for you to crank up your old tune here. It's very much a big club and you're not in it moment. Peter Mandelson had met Sir Charles Pole, now Baron Pole, of Bayswater, of course, and his wife through Charles's brother, Sir Chris Powell, pronounced Powell, same family, who was a Labour supporter, and he was also the CEO of BNP-DDB, which was this enormous advertising agency that also happened to do all of Labour's advertising campaigns. They have another brother, Jonathan Powell, pronounced Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and then Downing Street Chief of Staff until 2007. And today, Jonathan Powell is National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. And it was in this role that he advised Starmer that Peter Mandelson should absolutely not be appointed as ambassador to the US.
It's one big club and you're not in it.
As a nice sort of touch, Jonathan Powell also happens to be an expert on Machiavelli, which I thought is fitting. So Charles Powell, his son, Hugh, I'm assuming Paul, might be Powell, but Hugh Powell also happened to work for David Cameron's Conservative administration as National Security Advisor. Of course, this isn't corruption or nepotism. This is just a new meritocracy. It just happens that the Powell family have the very dominant National Security Advisor gene. But you do wonder if there are any other non-Powells who might actually fit the job.
You would wonder, but then again, you might ask why Britain's upper house of parliament still contains hereditary members. So we can't have you asking something like that. We can't have you asking something like that, or pretty soon you'll be advocating for communistic revolution.
It doesn't contain them anymore, as we discussed last week. They got rid of them in March.
Right, of course. I'm so sorry. Look at me. So much for the tolerant left.
Also at this birthday dinner party were the Blairs, Tony and Sherry, naturally, but not Gordon Brown, naturally. John Birt, who was the Director General of the BBC. Robert Harris and his wife. He was then political editor of The Observer. He's now a very famous historical novelist. He was a close personal friend of Peter Mandelson's. Also there was Alistair Campbell and his partner, Fiona Miller, who also went on to become an advisor to both Tony Blair and his wife, Cherie, and Wahid Ali, who was another TV executive who in 1998 would be made the youngest and the first openly gay member of the House of Lords. And he would later become embroiled in another Starmer scandal after giving Keir Starmer and his wife tens of thousands of pounds undeclared in order to buy new clothes. Mandelson's other guests at his birthday were Gavin Davis, a former Goldman Sachs partner and a major Labour donor, who in 2001 also happened to be made chairman of the BBC, and the longtime presenter of Channel 4 News, Jon Snow, and also, for some reason, Sir John Mortimer, who is a barrister who wrote Rumpole of the Bailey, although maybe that should be pronounced Rumpowell of the Bailey. I don't know.
Oh, God. It really is one
So
big club and you're really not in it.
Yeah, I raised this dinner party because it's a very good model of my argument, hopefully throughout this mini-series, which is precisely not to say that what's going on here in public life and the media and politics from this point right up to the Epstein affair is a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. It's something quite different. It's not this dark, secretive, shadowy cabal, but almost its opposite. This is court politics. This is the start of a sort of transnational version of a kind of royal court in which all the backstabbing and briefing and agreements, and indeed, I believe all the alleged crimes of corruption, all of these shared complicities of various extents and levels. And that's what happens in court politics. People are both competing and collaborating to acquire as much wealth and influence as possible for themselves, but they're all still trying to do it in order to maintain this smooth and efficient running of the court, to keep the peasants at the gate out. So it doesn't matter here if you're Labour or Tory, if you're a politician or the head of the BBC or the presenter of Channel 4 News, you're all part of this same court. And it's in all of your interest to try and keep the court functioning, even while you're trying to attain political power or personal power or wealth yourself.
And before the 1997 election, it becomes clear at this point that Blair is likely to be prime minister at some point. And so therefore, all these people are trying especially hard to curry favor with what will likely be this new administration.
Yeah, that's how you get into a situation where Thatcher's foreign policy advisor hosts a birthday party for Labour's fixer, while his brother, who was also at the party, later advises a Labour leader not to appoint him. And most importantly, the court of politics, I think, explains why the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, ignored that advice, which we'll come on to later. But I said in an earlier episode that Mandelson's bizarre magic is his ability as this comeback kid. But at the same time, Mandelson has never been able to develop his own likeable public image. But that's because he doesn't have to. Mandelson's political mastery is not with the public, but within the court. And it's no surprise to me that Starmer thought he'd be the ideal ambassador to Donald Trump, whose entire career rests on court politics and is the closest that the States has ever got to a king. What I'm saying is that this is class politics, in which internal divisions within the ruling class are far preferable to challenges from outside the ruling class. These internal differences are a small price to pay when they allow for a smooth transition of power between a centre-left party and a right-wing administration that won't fundamentally disrupt the economic order. This birthday party is a microcosm of something much wider, and I think important in understanding the potency of the network around Epstein, which is that the ruling class almost always demonstrates impeccable class solidarity. To me, the DNC, for example, opting to prefer a Trump presidency over a Bernie presidency is the ruling class equivalent of not crossing the picket line. You'll miss a day's pay, but long term, they understand the principle of solidarity is absolutely essential to everyone's survival. I think the billionaire Warren Buffett was right when he said, quote, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning," end quote. So I know this is a very vulgar Marxist critique, but the problem with vulgar Marxist critiques is they have a remarkably high hit rate when it comes to actually explaining things.
Vulgar Marxism and vulgar Freudianism, as vulgar as possible, will get you farther than a lot of other things.
Carla Powell, Charles Powell's wife, is this fascinating figure who comes into Mandelson's life at this point. They have a sort of aromantic romance, almost like a friendship, a very deep friendship. And in many ways, she was his entry to this new world, this opportunity to create a new Mandelson as well as a new Labour. So while Sir Charles could offer his advice and his experience from years of advising Thatcher, Carla could offer like a way of being within this new high society, and Mandelson was completely enraptured by it. As McIntyre puts it, quote, "The empathy was not difficult to understand. Both loved high-grade gossip and were fixated on the personalities of politics. Both had a well-developed sense of fun. Both had charm, style, and, when necessary, discretion," end quote. That extract could come from any memoir of any courtier, from the Han Dynasty to the Sun King. But I think in a contemporary context, such a mutual relationship with a heterosexual couple can only be reconciled with a queer person. I think if he's straight, he couldn't have developed this double friendship with the two. That's my personal read. Maybe I'm wrong. But the access that Charles and Carla gave to Peter to their friends was mirrored in the access that Peter would then give these sort of high-powered, pro-business Tories to the New Labour project. It was bringing the two groups together within the ruling class. And it led to Murdoch describing Mandelson as, quote, "a star fucker," which I think is a good quote. Perhaps not least because one of Mandelson's new best friends at the time was actually Rupert Murdoch's famously bypassed daughter, Elizabeth Murdoch. And in language that was typical of the time, Punch magazine noted that, quote, "His fondness for powerful women is such that he has been described as the original hag fag," end quote.
Oh boy. That's pretty
So
great.
this sort of sexist and homophobic language wasn't just a norm at the time. It also has to be noted that Punch was owned at this point by Harrods owner Mohammed Al-Fayed, who at the time was locked in his own love-hate relationship with the British ruling class, and of course would later become notorious as well for his own alleged sexual offences against women and girls.
Right.
So in 1996, wanting to be closer to this new circle of friends, Mandelson bought a house in Notting Hill, which at the time was a very trendy neighbourhood at the sort of crest of a wave of gentrification, as depicted in the 1999 film Notting Hill.
Absolutely rotten film, by the way.
That's one of my go-to hangover films. I must have seen it 40 times.
Wow.
At this point, he currently only owned his flat in Clerkenwell, which is nice, but not Notting Hill. And it would come nowhere close to the cost of what he was looking to acquire, which was this beautiful Victorian townhouse with a stucco front and this gorgeous 19th century cast iron veranda on Northumberland Place. He went through lunch with a friend of his who was an MP called Geoffrey Robinson. Robinson was one of Parliament's richest MPs. He'd been a sort of early tech millionaire working in aerospace, as well as being a beneficiary of a tax haven trust fund that was established for him by an elderly Belgian businesswoman in his name. This is another feature of court politics, of course. Most full-time jobs that we've had are exactly that, full-time, but somehow you can manage to be both an MP and establish a multi-million-pound aerospace engineering firm at the same time. To me, if you're a teacher, you probably don't have time to also work in a bar. That would seem ridiculous, but somehow you can balance these two jobs at the same time.
Of course, and this is a classic of parliamentarians all across the West, having this second job and making six figures to represent the public's interest could never possibly be enough.
And then once you retire, going on to work for exactly the organisations you were supposed to be legislating. But in 1996, Robinson was flush with cash, and as a new key Brown ally, he was deeply enmeshed in the New Labour project. He'd actually just splashed out on a new toy. He'd bought the New Statesman magazine, which was an icon of the centre Labour left. but at the same time was very much a loss-making venture at that point. So at lunch, he suggested that he could loan Peter the cash that he needed, which was almost £375,000 in 1996 money. If you're wondering what £375,000 could buy you in 1996, I can tell you, it's also what he paid for the New Statesman. So this house was the cost of the New Statesman.
You're not in it.
Yes. So this loan will become very significant in the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History. So remember it. But he had the home gutted and redone in this stark minimalist style by a promising young architect, and he filled it with status symbols like an Eames armchair, for example. Mandelson was very nicely ensconced in his new townhouse, which was a perfect base for the sort of socialising that he'd become famous for amongst the rich. And perhaps Robinson saw it as an investment. It was drawing Mandelson closer to a key Brown ally. And it also gave him the space to do the schmoozing, which was in some ways necessary to bring in a new Labour government. He needed to seduce the media especially. And as the 1997 election drew closer, we see this new media image of Mandelson emerging as a very modern and trendy politician. It's not entirely a positive image, and it's definitely one that's often tinged with a homophobia that would today often be rendered more as innuendo. But at this point in the late 90s, that sort of homophobia was ironic but open. It's this sort of moment where I think most journalists and commentators in the London political and literary scene would know gay people, they would have gay friends, and they would socialise with gay people. They'd regard themselves as fundamentally open-minded, but they would still use language and reference to gays in a way that was both probably correct, but politically incorrect. The sort of language, the sort of way that gay people talk to each other today was something that straight people would also talk about gay people with.
And again, it's one thing when we're making these jokes among ourselves, and it's quite another thing when these jokes are being made about us by people who 5 years earlier were talking about the innocent victims of AIDS being the children who we might possibly infect with our disgusting habits or whatever the hell it was that they were saying.
Yeah, I regard it as a sort of Christopher Hitchenization of homophobia. He would call people faggots, but at the same time, he would lament that his heterosexuality was his default because gay men had too much dignity to fuck him. You know, I mean, it's homophobic and it's often amusing. And so we see in this representation of Mandelson at the time as being this sort of effete London media faggot, a lovey in politer terms, perhaps. But we also recognise that this represents a significant and meaningful political shift away from this old image of a Labour frontbench who discuss industrial policy with trade union leaders over beer and sandwiches and smoking their cigarettes. And so it's at this point that the press give him one of his first nicknames, Mandy, which obviously is queer-coded, if not homophobic. But this queer coding of Mandelson was actually a double-edged sword because although it was often derogatory, it still suggests that Labour was modern and young and even daring. Homosexuality at this point was still often seen as something a bit edgy, something that wouldn't be discussed in polite society. And the popular opinion at that time was that this presentation of a sort of cosmopolitan, well-presented, hostess-friendly aesthete, Jack, just say gay, this is taking forever, that was seen to be a liability in the Labour heartlands, but it was also a potential asset in swing constituencies that were looking for a more modern Labour Party that had broken with the socialist past. And so it's at this moment that we get this legendary but apocryphal story that really encapsulates the whole affair. In this anecdote, Peter Mandelson is on the campaign trail in Hartlepool and he enters a chippy, a fish and chip shop. So he orders his fish and chips and then he points over the counter to a bowl of mushy peas and he adds, "And I'll have some guacamole, please."
Even I know that's not guacamole. Oh, my God.
Yeah, of course. And this never happened, right? This is purely apocryphal, but it didn't stop it reverberating around the public discourse of the day. And it remains one of the most common about Peter Mandelson. But it also epitomizes the moment. There's the class aspiration in the country where the avocado was still seen as exotic and largely uneaten. The pretensions and cluelessness of the cosmopolitan elite to the lives and cultural traditions of the working class.
Right.
And then the British obsession with food as a political indicator, which continues to this day.
Right.
When future bad gay subject Wes Streeting was opposing Jeremy Corbyn's ban on McDonald's at the party conference, he said, quote, "McDonald's may not be the trendy falafel bar that some people in politics like to hang out at, but it's enjoyed by families across the country," end quote. Or when Owen Smith was challenging Corbyn for leadership of the Labour Party, there was this hilarious episode where he's being interviewed by a journalist in a cafe in South Wales. And rather than ordering a cappuccino, he orders a frothy coffee and it's served to him. And he says, I tell you, this is the first time I've ever been given little biscuits and a posh cup in here. Seriously, I'd have a mug normally. So this is what Mandelson's experiencing, that politicians who lack some nebulous idea of authenticity are actually out of touch with the real lives of the Labour voter. But of course, it's pure projection. In a nation of a Costa coffee every 25 foot, the regular voter is not mesmerised and intimidated by the exoticism of a cappuccino.
Yeah.
But in Mandelson's case, I think that is linked inextricably with his homosexuality. But none of these contradictions and complications were a meaningful concern for the electorate when in May 1997, Britain held a general election. Labour romped through to a landslide victory, gaining a 179-seat majority and a major mandate for change. For Mandelson, the result was even better. He increased his majority by a whopping 20 percentage points. And the election was very significant culturally and politically for Britain. It was the end of 18 years of Tory rule, and it seems to suggest a major change was underway. I'm afraid for those criminologists who enjoyed episode 1's deep dive into Labour Party politics, I'm going to skimp on the story of Labour's victory in these wider political terms, because it's an oft-told story. But instead, as this is a homosexual history of Mandelson, look briefly here at sex and gender in that period. Labour's victory did seem to accompany a brief but influential moment of cultural triumphalism in Britain, a renaissance that was known as Cool Britannia. The 1990s saw the emergence of a new focus on a certain representation of British and usually working class and usually male culture especially, and a backlash against the left-wing political cultural arguments towards equality and feminism that had made some inroads in the 1980s. I guess you could say that chauvinism became cool again, whether that was male chauvinism or national chauvinism, all dripping in various layers of irony. In mid-90s Britain, everyone was talking about laddism or lad culture, a celebration of what was depicted as traditional male working class interests: football, lager, casual sexism. And a whole new genre of lads mags popped up, featuring scantily clad women and an editorial line that revelled in explicit discussion of sex, usually with quite a misogynistic bent. Alongside this, a new wave of pop music emerged, which was quite varied in both politics and music, but was all lumped together as Britpop, and which usually represented a move away from this sort of slick London-centred Coke and Thatcherism pop of the 80s towards cities like Manchester and Sheffield and Leeds, with seemingly a bit more spit and grit in the image. Bands like Oasis and Pulp projected images of very different forms of working-class masculinity, while bands like the wonderful Kinnock and the Spice Girls also presented these very different forms of feminist empowerment. Even in contemporary art, the dry formalism and conceptualism of the 80s had given way to the YBAs, who drew their influences from tabloid language and shock tactics, and working-class artists like Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin became household names. Perhaps key to understanding this renaissance was a renewed media focus on a wider popular football culture, as it became more accessible again following the suppression of hooligan culture in the 80s, and England's hosting of and its relative success in Euro 96 football tournament. Football was regarded as both like homosocial and a working class domain, and the England team's success on the field, just as New Labour were emerging, seemed like a reminder of Britain actually under Wilson's Labour of the 1960s when England won the World Cup. The England flag and the Union Jack, long suspected as having been largely ceded to the far right, re-emerged, and with it, coincidentally, the far right also re-emerges with the new British National Party at the end of the 90s. And the more politically correct stand-up comedians of the 80s gave way to shows like Men Behaving Badly and sports shows like Baddiel and Skinner's Fantasy Football. And indeed, Baddiel and Skinner had a hit song with It's Coming Home, which was England's Euro 96 anthem, which in some ways seemed to be as much about New Labour and working class pride coming home as football itself. But with this cultural renaissance, issues of race and gender and sexuality sometimes became very sharp. It was similar to the sort of anti-woke reaction we're seeing today, like cultural figures could mark themselves out as different and bold by rejecting the 1980s attempts by the left to make British public life a little bit more welcoming for minorities. So, for example, when engaging in a largely synthetic chart battle with another band, Blair, the Oasis lead singer Noel Gallagher said, quote, "The bass player and a singer, I hope the pair of them catch AIDS and die because I fucking hate them too." End quote.
What a charmer.
Yeah. And when the comedian David Baddiel parodied the black footballer Jason Lee on his BBC Two show Fantasy Football, he did so in blackface. This is in the 90s, in blackface, with a pineapple on his head, which was supposed to emulate Jason Lee's dreadlocked bun. That would have been inconceivable a decade earlier, I think, in the alternative comedy world, but now is becoming acceptable on TV. And I think here I want to assert another point about class, which is I think actually Laddism and Cool Britannia often involved a great deal of ventriloquizing of middle-class, rapidly approaching middle-age male voices onto young working-class men. So David Baddiel's blackface routine, for example, it might have presented itself as a sort of uncensored, gritty voice of the terraces, but he's a privately educated Oxbridge graduate, in contrast to someone like the football manager Brian Clough, who 20 years earlier had been chairman of the Anti-Nazi League. Like, working class culture is a lot more complicated, and it was ventriloquized as just like a place where you could kick back against the prudes and the politically correct.
Right, of course. Yeah, as a way of converting those energies into energies of reaction.
Exactly. So there was this very interesting cultural stuff going on, this cultural moment that would become Cool Britannia, but it was fundamentally, I think, quite reactionary. So it was very fitting, for example, when in 1996, Jerry Halliwell described Margaret Thatcher as the first Spice Girl. You can see why in this environment, supposedly mistaking mushy peas for avocado was a sin that people still associate with you 3 decades later. And within this Cool Britannia movement, people of colour were largely ignored, women were largely objectified, and gays were largely absent. Being openly gay didn't really buy you any cultural cachet, and gay activism still seemed inextricably linked with the loony leftism that, New Labour was defined against. So despite their focus on dynamism and youth, New Labour were quite tentative about rocking this cultural boat. And following the election, there were only actually 9 people of colour who were sitting as MPs. 8 of them were Labour. And there was only one person of colour who was featured on the 1997 Labour Party manifesto, and that was?
Who was it?
Nelson Mandela.
Oh, of course.
And likewise, after the election, 101 Labour MPs were women. So yeah, you have this huge sort of boosted representation of women in Parliament, but they were photographed en masse with Tony Blair, and they became known in the press almost universally as the Blair Babes. Everything was very dual-edged, yeah. And so while there were a handful of publicly, openly gay MPs who were elected in 1997, Peter Mandelson, who was the newly appointed minister without portfolio, was very pointedly not one of them. He wasn't out at this point. In next week's episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, we'll look at how that changed with Mandelson's spectacular public outing live on TV and the Labour government's approach to LGBTQ rights at the time. And we'll also look at Mandelson's responsibilities from the Millennium Dome to Northern Ireland, and then at his own parliamentary career, which would be rocked repeatedly by scandals until he graciously failed upwards into the sunny uplands of the European technocracy. And we'll hear of some murky rumours from the gay bars of Rio de Janeiro and the tentative flutterings of New Labour's deeply authoritarian impulses that came in response.
And if you can't wait for the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, it's available right now to our Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers to Extra Bad Gays. So click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or head to patreon.com/badgayspod and keep listening right now.
Bad gays.